We live in an age where simplicity seems to be a virtue. No matter where we go, no matter what we do, we are told to keep it simple, stupid. Supposedly because being simple and simplifying things is the key to getting things done. It is how we become efficient. It is how we stay efficient. And indeed, when being simple and when simplifying does work, it's great. But being simple is not the only characteristic of the world in which we live. Much of our world depends on interactions with other people, with things, with the environment, and with context, and interactions are seldom simple. So what do you do when being simple is just not good enough? When trying to simplify fails? I call the answer Remedy 101. No matter where we look, we are being urged to recognize that simplicity is the answer. In an age of ever-increasing complicatedness and complexity, we are told that the answer lies with simplicity. Being simple is the right way to go. Less is more. Keep it simple, stupid. There is great power in simplicity. Simplicity, it seems, is the key to success. After all, the pathways to success can be very complicated and very complex. How much easier it is to go around the maze than to have to go through it. There is a relationship between simplicity and effectiveness. When we make things simple, most of the time we make them more effective. Staples even calls this relationship the easy button. Because not all of the parts of the world are simple, we also need to deal with the parts that are otherwise. Lessons that we may learn that work in the simple world don't necessarily apply in the rest of the world. And what do? We attempt to simplify. Just like Success Baby, our goal is to succeed, and we want to do that regardless of complexity and regardless of ambiguity. To confound things even more, sometimes what we think is simple because we have personally simplified it may be better understood as being complicated or complex or ambiguous, which means that our very act of simplifying has let us down. And then again, sometimes what we individually see as simple or obvious, others see as something else. Perhaps they see a different simple, or they see a reality which is more complicated than the one we think we are addressing. Simple may be a mismatch for the situation, or a mismatch for the others with whom we need to deal. But in simplicity's failure, as Henry Ford observed, lies great opportunity. Oftentimes, we encounter ambiguity. If we believe in the simplicity-effectiveness relationship, then ambiguity can get in the way of our success. Ambiguity challenges our notion of the simple. Should everyone have the same airplane seat? Caitlyn Jenner once wanted to know why there were no urinals in the ladies' room. And before the financial crisis, AAA ratings actually meant something. And then, well, they didn't. Ambiguity seems to counter simplicity. It makes things less effective, less easy to get done, more confusing. In truth, what ambiguity does is to introduce two kinds of uncertainty. One is given multiple values for the same thing, I am uncertain as to which value is appropriate. The other is a much more dangerous kind of uncertainty. It's an uncertainty with a capital U. It's the I don't know what to do, indeed I react like a deer in the headlights kind of uncertainty. Both kinds of uncertainty can be triggered when we disagree with the others with whom we need to be dealing. Let's try this with an example. I suspect we're all very familiar with the climate change debate. When you look at the graph of temperatures usually used to display global warming, this is the graph that you tend to see. Please notice the red line that slopes upward toward the right-hand side. When scientists and others who support the notion that global warming is an ever-present and ongoing problem speak about this graph, the red line is the conception they have in mind. But there is another way to look at exactly the same data. Instead of drawing one overall trend line, one could look for periods of stability amongst the rising trend. That is what this version of the graph shows. Please notice the blue lines. It is the same data, but a different interpretation. When contrarians suggest that there are opportunities available where the rise in global temperatures have historically slowed or stabilized, it is this interpretation of the graph which they are talking about. Same underlying data, same graph, different interpretation. These clashing interpretations are illustrative of what happens in what I call the chasm of dissonance. We have a high level of similarity, but we have two conflicting interpretations, and as a result, people engage in fairly strong disagreements. What happens is that the disagreements get expressed as conflict. Climate change is not a new conflict. This slide illustrates some others. It seems that the simplicity and effectiveness graph only applies when there is agreement and certainty with regard to meaning and context. This means we need to redefine the graph. The greater the amount of similarity which multiple observers share regarding the situation at question, the greater the amount of acceptability, which is the greater the willingness to enter into a real dialogue about the subject at hand, rather than arguing about what it is that's being seen, what it is that's being meant, and how we go about resolving the apparent ambiguities. When there is disagreement, there can be dissonance. Ambiguity creates many opportunities for dissonance. The surprise is what you see toward the right-hand side of this graph. In general, as similarity increases, acceptability increases, but only up to a point. Somewhere in the neighborhood of the 70% similar range, everything seems to fall off a cliff. Multiple people can't agree on the other 30%, and their lack of agreement produces dissonance. This is what we call the chasm of dissonance. It's a very important but seldom discussed pitfall when trying to sort out ambiguity. The act of simplifying, the act of trying to make the complex or complicated fit into a label, fails miserably when you're at the chasm. The dissonance instead takes over, and very little can be accomplished. You don't want to be in that chasm. And if you find yourself there, the truth is that more simplification will not get you out of it. Let's consider a couple of examples. Consider orphan drugs. These are drugs that do not have a large patient population, but the patients they do have really need them. For a manufacturer of these drugs, the math and the marketing can be very complicated. What do you do in an effort to make more money and to justify continuing? Or consider an airline servicing a small town. What happens in that town if the airline decides to cease commercial air service? Again, it's a complex situation, and trying to simplify just doesn't help. Indeed, achieving simplicity can be very hard when disagreement and ambiguity are everywhere that you look. And the solution is not to just put out more and more of the same. When you do that, instead you get something like this very cumbersome Swiss Army knife. It purports to be a simple solution that is able to do just about everything. But in fact, it's so cumbersome that you really can't use it to do almost anything. When simplicity isn't obvious, when it doesn't present itself to us, what we do is we create it. Sometimes, in fact most of the time, the simplicity that we deal with is actually our own construction. It is a product of our own heads. What we do is, in effect, create our own reality. We see the world. We process the world. But the way that we process it is to tell a story, our story. A story which makes sense of what it is we think we see, of what it is we think we need to deal with. And most of the time, what we do is we tell a simple story. We say that the world is X, or it is Y, or it is Z. We filter the reality that we see in order to produce this story. How? Well, first, we limit our field of attention. We narrow the context of what it is that we're dealing with. Then we limit the factors to be considered. We assert a set of boundaries and constraints. Then, given those boundaries and constraints, we predict likely outcomes. In effect, what we're doing now is constructing in our heads multiple realities based on the boundaries and constraints that we just, on our own volition, asserted. Finally, we pick among these multiple realities. In the act of picking, by choosing from among our predictions, we have taken what may be complex or complicated, and we've turned it into a simple construct, our simple construct. And these simple constructs are everywhere. We see it in the Staples Easy button. We see it in the Nike slogan, just do it. We see it in the Apple assertion that it just works. When faced with the choice of going for the complex or the simple, the choice that most of us most often make is to go for the simple. But that simplicity is not necessarily the clear, unambiguous answer that we seek. Indeed, simplification and simplicity does not mean certainty. Certainty itself can be rather elusive. Do you see the peasant girl in this slide? Or do you see a man? Maybe you see both. Can you see both at the same time? It's ambiguous. A problem with ambiguity and its lack of certainty is that the simplifications that we seek may not be shared by other people. It's not that they do not share our goal of simplifying. It's that they see something different than what we do, and they simplify in a manner different than the way we did. One of us perhaps saw the peasant girl. Another saw the man. What we do is we tell the story that we see and not the story that others around us see. The simple lesson here is that context matters. The slice of pizza, which seems very appealing while on the restaurant plate on the left, seems to be anything but appealing while sitting on the manhole cover on the right. We can look at some historic illustrations of the importance of context. In 1981, for example, Bill Gates, yes, that Bill Gates, said that 640K should be enough for anybody. Well, I've got 128 gigs on my cell phone. Or 100 years before that, consider Western Union's reaction to the telephone. This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. Really? Really? Your lesson is that context often differs amongst stakeholders. So with the orphan drug example, what the patients see, what the doctors see, what the manufacturers see, what the public health authorities see, they all have a different context, and the simple story they try to tell will be very different. The same is true for the small town losing its commercial air service. What the local businesses see, what the state as a whole see, what the airline sees, very different stories. And our solution for this is what's known as the black box. Now, the kind of black box we are talking about is not the one that you find on airplanes. That one records all of the data available to it for some given time. This black box is a logical tool, a tool that we use to simplify the world. A black box consists of the linkage between some input X and some output Y, where what goes on between X and Y is hidden from us. It is the black box which we assert contains the relationship between X and Y. And this is very important, we speak of black boxes like this as if they were real. Black boxes like this are the basic building blocks in the stories that we tell to ourselves and others about the simple world that we're either dealing with or that we have created. We use the black box as if it could make the world simple. We talk about the black box as if what went on inside did not matter. Instead, we speak of it as if the black box is all that matters. As an example, take the term our family. We can speak about it as if it was a unit. The words our family are a label or a box, inside of which lie untold layers of complicatedness and complexity. But we do not need to deal with those layers of complicatedness in the stories that we tell. Many such stories succeed merely by using the words, our family. Black boxes are the as-ifs we construct so that the stories that we tell can have simple ingredients. When we use black boxes appropriately, they can package ambiguity and complexity into simplicity. Indeed, that's the very message of the Staples Easy button, or of the idea behind takeout food, or of the drive-through window, or of Nike's Just Do It. We are packaging ambiguity and complexity into something simple. We use black boxes to simplify the world and to try to obtain agreement with one another. Inside the black box is some unknown and perhaps unexamined process. What we are capable of observing is the input to the box and the output from the box. We deliberately ignore the complexities of the mechanisms inside the box so as to simplify our reality. Indeed, we speak about the black box as if the mechanism inside simply does not matter. For example, when telling the story about taking the family up to Vermont to go skiing, I do not need to get into the intricacies of the fights between my daughter and my wife about what clothes to pack. But instead, I can tell you about the great meal we had when we stopped on Route 7 on the way to Vermont. By using a black box to simplify what it is we are talking about, we can make the complex and the complicated appear to be simple. But there is a danger. Black boxes can be used inappropriately. When used inappropriately, black boxes can proclaim a simplicity which just is not present. They encourage us to overlook context and to deny the very dependencies on context or on background assumptions, on our personal history, or on the other people that we are dealing with. Dependencies that matter. And instead, what inappropriate black box use does is it favors talking about a model or a label. And if the model or label are right, well, that's great. But depending on how wrong that model or label is, well, there's the danger of perhaps upcoming disaster. With inappropriate use, one can drown in ambiguity and in dissonance. Or worse, one can freeze like a deer in the headlights. In this context, what does appropriately mean? There are two important rules which help us to define appropriately. The first is what is called the modeling relation. The modeling relation is what tells us whether we actually have a model or if we merely have a description. A model is something that we can manipulate in the space of our minds or on a computer or on a piece of paper. And then, depending on what we observe in the model, we can decide how to implement things in real life. A description gives us no such opportunities. Manipulating a description has no implications for what happens in real life. The second such tool is what is known as the Law of Requisite Variety. This law says that the degrees of freedom, the number of variables that are available to be manipulated, which are present in a system, need to be similar in number in whatever it is that we try to use to control the system. If the controller has too many degrees of freedom, then the system gets lost in uncertainty and ambiguity. If the controller has too few degrees of freedom, then the system will be able to run away with itself. Together, the modeling relation and the law of requisite variety allow us to determine whether we have a good fit, whether we are using the black box appropriately for the given situation or the given problem. Appropriately means that we can tell the right kind of stories that will help create the right kind of opportunities. Getting stories and black boxes to be appropriate is the solution for what to do when the act of simplifying fails. The modeling relation helps us to determine whether we are dealing with a model or merely a description. In the chart shown here, the formal system over on the right is a model of the natural system on the left. It is a model because all four of the marked elements are present. There is some notion of causality in the natural system. Activity in the natural system can be encoded into a representation in the formal system. Within the formal system, we can manipulate variables in order to draw inferences. And finally, we can decode the lessons of those inferences and manipulations into some actual implementation in the natural system. To be a model, the formal system has to be present along with all four of these relationships. If any one of them is missing, you only have a description and not a model. The importance of this relation is that it makes clear to distinguish the role of the observer from the role of the actor. With models, one can look at observations in the representation and draw conclusions about what they might mean in the real world. You can experiment. Models allow us to play. They allow us to understand what might happen. Being able to play, being able to draw conclusions without actually having to take actions which might have real consequences is very important. It is the key ingredient to allowing one to have resilience. By contrast, when dealing with a description, manipulations can only play with the description itself. They have no real-world consequences. They cannot be decoded into some actual implementation or embodiment into the real world. Our risk is much lower if we can model a potential action before we commit to it, rather than having to act and then describe the consequences. Both the orphan drug patients and the small town facing the loss of airplane service would prefer to first deal with a model of what might happen, rather than suddenly be confronted with a description of the when and why that service they needed, was stopping. The law of requisite variety is a very important concept from cybernetics. It addresses the degree of balance between the degrees of freedom which may be present in a system and the degrees of freedom which may be present in some kind of a controller. When the controller has a few degrees of freedom greater than the system trying to be controlled, that system can be stable. Too many excess degrees of freedom, and the controller is confronted with ambiguity and uncertainty. Too few degrees of freedom, and the system has the ability to run away from the controller. Let's take a very familiar example which clearly demonstrates the notion of appropriateness and inappropriateness with regard to black boxes and simplification. This is a map of the London subway system. This map is highly effective if you wish to actually use the subway, or the underground as they call it, to get from one station to another. However, the map is next to useless if you want to walk. It does not tell you what direction to go or how to get there. The map was greatly simplified. It is appropriate to its function, and its function is simply the use of the subway. It is not a map of the surface. By contrast, this is a chart that actually has been on exhibit in the London Underground. It purports to show what you would need to do in the underground system if you wish to replicate climbing the summit of various mountains. As a description, it's interesting, but it's not a model. There's no way to actually take any meaningful action on most of the stairways as they're shown here because they're closed and locked from the public. The stations have elevators. And note, actual mountain summits have limited oxygen and rather rugged terrain. Instead, subways have dank, foul-smelling air and an endless set of concrete steps. However, adding a little bit of information can help with the appropriateness of the London subway map. While the map itself cannot help you to determine how to walk from one station to another, by adding some walk timing information, you might be able to see how long it would take to walk. And this version of the map has the number of minutes of walking time between each of the stations added. Please note, same distance as shown on this map has very different walking times, which reveals the inadequacy of the map and its inappropriateness to be used to tell you how to walk on the surface of the streets. This is another appropriate chart. It shows the average one-bedroom rental cost in the neighborhood of each tube stop. So how is it that we go about determining appropriateness. This slide shows you some questions you might ask. Are you presenting a model which can be acted upon, or are you merely offering up a description? Does your story encompass enough context to address the situation at hand or the problem that you're trying to address? Is your story open or closed to the current context of your listener? And it is the current context of the listener that matters, not some hypothetical context, not some prior context, not your context, but the actual context now of the listener. Remember, don't try to use a London subway map as a guide for how to walk between the stations on the street. Let's consider our drug and airport example. With both of them, discussions about the future based on new markets and increased revenues are inappropriate. It would be a discussion about things that cannot happen. However, discussions about the need for and form of subsidies that might keep the drug being supplied or the air service being offered, now that is appropriate. In general, there are 4 kinds of narratives that we can tell about black boxes or about our simple models. They are the anecdote, the metaphor, the abstraction, and the archetype. Each of these is dependent upon the listener, and on the listener much more than on the storyteller. Each of these narratives depends on the degree of similarity displayed between story and target, and on the degree of acceptance afforded the narrative by its listeners. Thus, overlaps and the size and extent of overlaps matter. When we tell stories of isolated incidents and we don't necessarily relate them to one another, we are telling anecdotes. There's little to no overlap here. When we compare 2 or more things using their similarities and ignoring their differences, we are telling stories that are metaphors. A is like B. Now we have some limited overlap, and that overlap is our focus, always being mindful of the differences which remain in the background. When we isolate the similarities into a category, and we tell a story that is about how the category separates itself from its context, that is an abstraction. The overlap is a focus here, but the focus is on the process about how we go about making the overlap actually fit the situation. When we tell stories that serve as exemplars, as the ideal example, and when we assert that category membership is determined by the variance from that exemplar, we are making use of archetypes. Now we are using the degree of overlap to exclude things as other and to define things as like us. It is important to realize that quite often we confuse one type of narrative for another, and in doing so, we lose sight of why we are telling the particular kind of story that we are telling. The kind of story that we tell, amongst those 4, affects the ability of our simplifications to work. The degree of similarity displayed between story and target, and the degree of acceptance afforded the narrative by its listener, together play the huge role in determining effectiveness. If you remember the Chasm of Dissonance from about 20 slides ago, this graph illustrates how the kind of narratives we tell maps along the curve of that chasm. Metaphors are less similar than abstract concepts. They have less shared information, but both are widely accepted. A key to their acceptance is that we usually make note that we are speaking metaphorically or that we're speaking abstractly. And when we make that note, we are allowing space for the listeners to react to the metaphor or the abstraction. Anecdotes, which are usually very context-specific and therefore filled with information, are also highly acceptable and will be perceived of as similar by multiple audiences due to that very specificity, the amount of information provided. By contrast, when we tell narratives which involve archetypes, we are making use of our personal background information in order to better identify why this story is, in and of itself, an exemplar. Others who possess different background information may disagree. And it is in that disagreement that we find the chasm of dissonance. narratives involving archetypes have the greatest potential for triggering the chasm of dissonance. The stories we tell, the way we tell them, the kind of narratives we tell, and the kind of black box we use as the subject of those stories all help to determine how the listener, the observer, finds value and potential opportunities for action in the story that's being told. It turns out that there are 6 kinds of black box. Since the kinds actually matter, we will go through them one at a time. They are the rigid, the malleable, the hooks and snaps, the permeable, the dissolvable, and finally, the chimera-like. With all these kinds of black boxes, it is important to remember that the output of the black box is an input to the observer, and then what the observer sees becomes an input back into the black box. The black boxes are used to simplify the world, but they are our own construction. They are a product of the observer's brain. To think about a black box without being mindful of this black box observer input-output circuit is to think about them in the wrong way. Let's begin with food as an example. To most steak and potato Midwesterners, kale is a very rigid black box, seldom understood, and even less often eaten. By contrast, any cook will tell you that eggs are among the most malleable of possibilities. Whether one is in a short order diner or a very fancy breakfast joint, hollandaise is attached and used via hooks or snaps. The kind of hollandaise is particular to each dish. To any baker, a pie crust is rather permeable. The outer layer of a chocolate lava cake represents the pinnacle of dissolvability. And then there are the Southerners' ubiquitous grits. Dissolvable, permeable, and malleable in every way to the Southerner, and rigid, inedible, and always prompting a what is this reaction to the New Englander. We could also look at the 6 kinds of black boxes by telling the story of McDonald's. Type 1, the rigid black box, is the way a neighborhood zoning board might look at a request for a McDonald's to move in. McDonald's is seen as a solid thing. Its internal processes are irrelevant to the zoning board. By contrast, the highway rest stop planner sees McDonald's as a malleable black box. McDonald's is willing to change what they do, what they sell, what hours they keep, all to make the rest stop work better. Similarly, to a hungry driver on a highway, McDonald's is a hooks and snaps black box. If the driver gets hungry, McDonald's is a place to go. If the driver needs a bathroom, McDonald's is a place to go. If the driver needs a place to rest, well, McDonald's is a place to go. Whatever hook or snap is getting activated, McDonald's can do it. The permeable type of black box is illustrated by McDonald's recent decision to offer breakfast all day. Why? Because breakfast is what gets us into a McDonald's. We all understand that mechanism of get an Egg McMuffin. Similarly, a McDonald's Happy Meal to a 4-year-old is a prime example of a dissolvable black box. There is no distinction between the Happy Meal itself, the experience of getting the Happy Meal, the experience of eating the Happy Meal, the experience of sharing the Happy Meal with friends and parents. All of these have no distinct boundaries once that Happy Meal is placed in the hands of the 4-year-old. On the other hand, that very same Happy Meal, when viewed by the child's vegan parents, takes on a chimera-like quality. The child certainly believes in it. Well, the vegan parents, they're not so sure. But at least it keeps Billy quiet. Let's begin with the rigid type of black box. The rigid type says, I am a black box. Accept me as such. Do not probe into my inners. They are hidden from you. I stand alone. Examples of such rigid black boxes? The living room radio that sat in your parents' or grandparents' house. Few in the house understood how it worked or dared to probe its innards, but it brought news and music from the outside world into the house. It functioned as a standalone black box. It worked much the same way that Apple suggests that Apple products work, namely, they just work. Do not open. Do not probe. Just accept that they work the way they're intended to work. The malleable kind of black box is very different. It is capable of being inserted into processes and then being ignored. It is there precisely because we want to place attention on the inputs and outputs and not on the middle black box device. Being ignored is the goal. Some typical examples: the universal charger that plugs into the wall and into any of your portable devices. It's there to work, but to be ignored. Or the way that apps have taken over the ecosystem of smartphones. When we are using apps on the phone, we are ignoring the phone. It merely has become a platform for the operation of the apps, and we are supposed to pay attention to the app and not to the phone. To go back to our McDonald's example, there are neighborhoods that would welcome McDonald's, and there are neighborhoods that are petrified of the very idea that a McDonald's might be there. Yet, where the neighborhood zoning board may react with fear to the rigid black box of a quote-unquote McDonald's and all that that supposedly entails, the highway rest stop planner is eagerly planning multiple possibilities of how to best take advantage of a McDonald's at a rest stop. To him, it's the ultimate in malleable service providers. Hooks and snaps are another form of malleable black box. But with these, the activity centers around someplace on the exterior of that black box where there is a hook or a snap which matches some specific context, which itself can then be hooked or snapped. The idea is that the hooks and snaps call attention to themselves rather than to the bulk of the black box, and that the very process of what goes on in the black box to which they are attached remains hidden. An ideal example of such a hook and snaps black box is how the immune system works, where there are particular folds and particular receptors which attract the outside invader. Black boxes become very interesting when their boundaries become permeable, when the box itself includes a vision of how its inner workings work. Permeability means that there's a possibility of interactions with context, that there can be an interchange between the context and the contents of the black box. Permeability can be accomplished via a gate, multiple gates, or perhaps holes in the boundary. When a black box is permeable, we can see some of what's going on and react to what we can see. When a black box is permeable, processes can take place which affect the interactions and change maybe the black box, maybe the context, maybe the content, maybe the input or the output of the black box processes. Permeability provides great opportunities for change. I am told that in biology, what I have just described is basically how antigens work, but I will be the first to confess I'm no biologist. Hunger and appeal demonstrate McDonald's versions of both the hooks and snaps and permeable black boxes. McDonald's goal is to have something to offer everyone at any time of the day, and to a tired driver on a highway, they often do. But to permeate our desires the rest of the time, McDonald's now wisely offers breakfast all day. At times, who could resist the pull of an Egg McMuffin? Even if it is really time for drinks. Now that's permeability. The ultimate version of permeability is dissolvability. Not only can the boundary be penetrated and seen through, but in the right context, in the right kind of situation, given the right kind of interaction, the boundary can be dissolved. Perhaps the best example of dissolvable black box is the scientific explanation. When we provide a scientific explanation, we are opening up the mechanisms of how the input becomes the output. We may refer to the explanation itself by a name or a label, and the name or label becomes a boundary, but that boundary is fully dissolvable. We often say X is explained by the law of large numbers, or by the second law of thermodynamics, or perhaps by the law of gravity. The problem child black box is the one referred to as chimera-like. This black box appears as dissolvable to those who believe in it, to those who see the black box as actually providing an explanation. But this black box is a type 1 rigid, I am a black box, to those who do not possess such a belief. The obvious example of such black boxes are religions and any other form of reasoning which demands belief over evidence. Think of that McDonald's Happy Meal. To the 4-year-old, it dissolves any and all boundaries, and it's just happiness. But if the child has vegan parents, well, each of the black boxes maps to a different kind of narrative. Metaphors are malleable and sometimes of the hooks and snaps variety, while abstractions, they sometimes are hooks and snaps and sometimes are permeable. Anecdotes are found at both ends. They could be rigid when they have no relationship to the audience, and they can be dissolvable when they're so specific and rich with context that the audience deals with the story on its own terms and not on theirs. And then there is the problem child, the narrative told as an archetype, which displays both rigidity and dissolvability at the same time. It is chimera-like, and in its chimera-likeness arises the very problems of dissonance. The orphan drug and the small town air service can work as examples of one another. So if the form of the discussion is a metaphor or an abstraction, there's enough generality there and enough way for the audience to bring its story in that it has meaning. But if you try to explain either of these things by means of an archetypal story, you run the risk of losing your audience. For example, the pricing details of a hepatitis C drug will drown out any meaning that the audience understands when talking about the need for subsidies. The dissonance happens when the believers see all too clearly the true meaning of the archetypal label or story, while the others have trouble relating the story to their own view of the world. Without both a perception of agreement and of appropriateness, simplification simply fails to be effective. Both are required. You need agreement and you need appropriateness. And it allows two kinds of simplicity. One kind of similarity has to do with other people. The other kind of similarity has to do with the appropriateness of a model. Each of the 6 kinds of black box provides separate context. That context allows for different actions, different behavior, different interpretations, different possibilities, and different narratives. Each has a different acceptance potential. So the similarities, the agreement, and the acceptance is different. And each is observer dependent. And you must remember, when telling stories, it is your listener who matters. The kind of black box you use to tell the story will affect how it is received. You need to get buy-in. You need to have others say, I can accept this. I understand it. It fits in with my personal understanding, background. What you're looking for is resonance. And if you don't have resonance, you will not get buy-in. Thus, if I've made anything clear to you in the past 40-odd minutes, it's that simplicity isn't always that simple. Every idea we process, every product we buy, every business we encounter, they all make use of black boxes in an effort to simplify the reality they're dealing with. The key is deciding which black box and which narrative is being dealt with, which black box to use, and what kind of narrative to tell. How do we make that decision? We do it by coping. As Richard Rorty told us, knowledge is not a matter of getting reality right, but rather a matter of acquiring habits for action, for coping with reality. If this talk has been about anything, it has been about how you might better cope. So, how do you cope when the effort to simplify fails? When trying to turn the complicated or the complex into something simple just isn't working? Well, the answer is you have to ask some questions. You ask where the failure lies. Is it in the lack of requisite variety? Is it in the kind of narrative you're telling? Or is it in the kind of black box that you're using? Or maybe it's some combination of all three. It's critical to remember that you want to be talking in terms of models. So you must also recall the modeling relation and use it to examine the situation that you're in. You can find simplicity. You can get an effective simplification by reconstructing the modeling relation for a given situation. You need first to make sure that you actually have a model. Descriptions won't work. You need a model. If you don't have a model, then you need to determine what it is that you have to do or change or know so that you can actually model the situation. Given a model, given the existence of a modeling relation, you have the ability to rehearse potential actions. And in that ability to rehearse, well, that's how you find a simple story to tell. That's what gives you resilience. And that's what actually allows you to find something that's going to resonate with the others and the situation that you need to resonate with. You can find appropriateness by examining your narrative and examining its black boxes. If your narrative is not working, then one of two things is happening. Your story may not be resonating with the others that you need, or the black boxes that you're using are a mismatch to the situation at hand. So you have to determine what you need to do or change or know so that you can find that match. You need a match and you need resonance. If you've got a match and you've got resonance, you've got the grounds for a simple, effective story. That's the trick. Model. Have a model. The model must match the situation and it must resonate with others. So when faced with what seems to be unmitigated complexity or complicatedness, remember the lessons of the orphan drug or the small town losing its airport. Look for that model that has match and that has resonance. The complex or the simple? The choice, it's always yours. So choose wisely. Thank you.